Welcome once again to our show, and thank you for watching. I have Don Richie on my left, who is my co-host and a new addition to the Illinois Committee for Honest Government and Issue Forum and the TV shows we do. And to my right, I have our guest, James Gierach, who has been a candidate both for governor and state's attorney and a prophetic and leading voice in legalization of drugs and approaching drugs from a different perspective than law enforcement and criminal. And I think that some of his predictions or his policy prescriptions have become reality today now, with medical marijuana and many states having legalization of marijuana, at least on the marijuana side. And of course, the current group is Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And that's his current group, and thank you very much for joining us.
Frank, it's a pleasure to be with you and Don both.
Okay. And of course, I should note that this show is done in honor of Randall Sherman of blessed memory, the founder of the Illinois Committee for Honest Government, and one of the technical person here, Mr. Can TV, William Gadomski, did a number of shows on legalization of drugs, at least since the mid-90s that I'm aware about, with River North or River, it's River something, I don't want to misstate it. And he did a number, William Gadomski, who was our technical person, he did a number of shows on legalization, quoting, I believe it was either Confucius or Lao Tzu, that you can't overreact to an issue or you increase it. So let's talk about, first of all, let's talk, I'm going to do it in reverse a little bit. What are the trends now in Illinois government and national government that are coming to fruition that weren't so, let's say, 20 years ago?
Nationally and internationally, public policy is changing to allow and tolerate people to use drugs, which previously had been absolutely prohibited. There are 3 United Nations drug treaties. The first one was passed in 1961 that requires the nations of the world who signed the treaty, and there are 186 of those nations, they must go home.
Including the U.S.
Including the United States, one of the biggest pushers of it. You must go home and pass criminal laws outlawing the recreational use of any of these substances. And the schedules attached include heroin and marijuana in the same Schedule 1. The schedule's making no sense at all. So the United States comes home, and it takes them until 1970 before they pass the Controlled Substances Act. And then it takes another year before Nixon declares a war on drugs in 1971 when we really didn't have much of a problem with drugs. The best heroin in America at the time was 2% pure. We've now engaged in that war on drugs for some 43 years, and we now have 90% pure heroin across the United States and around the world. We have invented crack cocaine that didn't exist before. We have an epidemic of meth. We've increased the availability of meth by increasing the penalties on the substance, making them the equivalent, basically, of heroin. The irony of drug prohibition is the harder you try and suppress drugs, supposedly to protect the kids, the worse the drug problem becomes. Why? Because when people want to use a substance, and they have since the beginning of time, to affect their mental consciousness.
Well, let me break in. So,
sure.
From the beginning of time, but you haven't had the recreational drug use that you see today. So, for example, if I'm a Incan Indian in the hills of Peru, I might take a cocoa plant and I chew it.
Cocoa leaf.
Cocoa leaf, and I chew it so I have the energy to get up and high altitude. And
exactly.
However, it wasn't in a concentrated form, and it wasn't for recreational purposes. Similarly, you have hallucinogenic drugs, for example, peyote, that Indians in the Southwest use for religious purposes, as well as other hallucinogenic drugs.
For centuries.
For centuries. However, they were not recreational drugs. They were used more occasionally for a religious, spiritual purpose. So today we have more purified forms of what were leaves or mushrooms or caps off cactuses or whatever they may be that were used either for some energy or tea or something of that nature in a much diluted form and for more occasional religious forms. You didn't have the kind of recreational use that you see today. In fact, even when I was a boy, you didn't have the recreational use that you see today.
Let me explain why I think that's the fact. And it is true. We didn't have a war on drugs in all of these other eras. We tried a war on drugs on alcohol in the 1930s, and it failed miserably. And after 13 years, we saw, oh my God, we got more booze. The stuff is slashing. The suds are slashing down the gutters as the police break the barrels open. We've got gangsters shooting each other, hanging off of running boards with Tommy guns. We got corruption of the police. We've got excessive violence. All of the things we don't want. So prohibition, ironically, causes what it's designed to prevent. We're supposed to be protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. And when we prohibit drugs that people want, what we end up doing is increasing the value of the substance to the point where people are importing the drugs and trying to get into the drug business to make the money. So that you end up taking something that grows on a plant and make it the most valuable commodity on the face of the earth. So in any number of these drugs that you mentioned, they're all more powerful, they're all worse, and then they become so common and so readily available that now they compete by increasing the strength and by reducing the price. So the consequence of prohibition is, instead of less drugs, which we intended, we have more drugs at cheaper price, stronger purity, and prohibition still in place so that they're more dangerous because you can't control and regulate something that you outlaw. The irony of prohibition is when you outlaw something, you can't control and regulate it.
Well, let me break in here now. I agree with you that prohibition would not work and that it created a side effect that people were already gangsters. They were already people involved in a criminal element for the most part. Some were legitimate businesses that went visit people in a criminal element. But when you talk about a Lucky Luciano or a Nucky Johnson, who the Nucky Thompson from Boardwalk Empire is based off in Atlantic City, or Joe Kennedy, or
Larry Hoover.
In any number of people. Well, Larry Hoover's obviously later. I'm talking just Prohibition. Larry Hoover wasn't around.
All right.
And Larry Hoover wasn't around in Prohibition. But two things is that people who talk about Prohibition historically say two things. One is there was a major problem at the time when the Christian Temperance Union was around, and I think they were in Evanston, if I'm not mistaken. And even until recently, a lot of towns, suburbs around Chicago had blue laws. I remember I went to a Mariano somewhere, and I think it was right outside the city, and they said it was after 10, we can't sell you alcohol, or Sundays you can't buy alcohol. Or there were some were dry towns. Park Ridge was dry until recently, I believe. So you've had a lot of inheritance from that era. But one, that you had a number of people that were getting so drunk, and that's why some of our alcohols are watered down now. They couldn't work. They were beating up their families. That alcoholism was a severe problem before Prohibition, number one. But number two, the statistics for Prohibition is alcohol drinking and alcoholism did go down. Now, there was an illegal market that many people had access towards, but that the actual amount of drinking was down.
Well, anytime you prohibit something, it's very difficult to measure how much drinking is going on. The interesting thing about the Prohibition era of alcohol was that it was just the churches that were still able to get it. The Christian Brothers Winery and so forth were the ones where you get it. The people who were political powerhouses knew that Prohibition was coming, so they bought these huge stocks of liquor to stack their own cabinets, but we weren't going to let the public have that. Oftentimes, Prohibition has a morality base to it, and we intend to try to help people from themselves. When the reality is government cannot successfully engage in morality policing. Because when you engage in morality policing, you're giving up those limited police hours of work and taking them from murder and armed robbery and rape and home invasion and putting them in watching who is voluntarily selling drugs from one person to another, which isn't against the law unless you decide you want to make it against the law. In the 1600s, during the Ottoman Empire, they outlawed smoking, and the penalty for violation was death. Different era, we outlaw alcohol for a while. Right now, we're outlawing all these other products that grow naturally in nature. And so now you can't have marijuana, so we have synthetic drugs being created, which have nothing to do with the plant, that are much more dangerous to kids who are ingesting them. You can't kill yourself on marijuana, but you can kill yourself very easily on K2, or one of these substitution salts. I have attended the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna for each of the last 3 years, which is where drug policy for the world is made, and where they implement the the 3 prohibition treaties that I mentioned earlier. And 3 years ago when I went, there were 43 new synthetic drugs invented in the past year, because it can't be against the law if the drug cartels just had their chemists invented. It'd be an ex post facto law. The second year I go back, it was 50-some new drugs that were created synthetically, and this last year, in March 2014, they had over 100 new synthetic drugs created. New harmful drugs for the populace, making the drug problem exponentially worse instead of better because of the supposed moralistic view that we're going to protect people from themselves and prohibit drugs.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if I could ask you a question, Jim. And I understand, you know, right now, it does seem that there's a certain momentum in the direction of at least legalizing marijuana. I mean, we have this been legalized, I guess, to some extent in Colorado and Oregon and Washington and also Alaska. But now, you're talking about legalizing heroin and cocaine, things like that as well, not just marijuana?
Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, the group that I'm affiliated with, is made up of former narcotics agents, former DEA agents, former judges, prosecutors, people who fought the war on drugs. And they're opposed to drug use. They were before, they still are. But the conclusion that they came to is that the war on drugs is worse than drugs.
Oh.
And so that it is better to control and regulate dangerous things rather than say you can't have it. That has the effect not only of putting more drugs available everywhere of worse types where you can't even carefully use them because you turn the lights off in Prohibition so that you don't know what the substance is. The guy you're buying it from probably doesn't know what it is, how pure it is, whether it was cut with something it shouldn't have been. So it's more dangerous. It's like the bathtub gin. It's like this K2 stuff is terrible. So it's better to recognize some people are going to use the substance. And
does that make the government then the new purveyor of drugs, the new drug dealer, so to speak?
Well,
or do you do it for pharmaceutical companies? Because here's my concern with the legalization of medical marijuana in Illinois. It's going to become like the casinos, a select group of very wealthy, politically connected people, even though it's supposed to be double blind. They're going to get these places. I saw one gentleman who has allegedly stuff that's not positive, I won't say the name, that he, as a part of Chicago, wants to make an agricultural area in this part of Chicago where there was a famous alderman of in that particular ward. Now, I'm not saying that that isn't a good idea, because maybe it is a good idea. What I see is a lot of politically connected names as either the owners or the lobbyists of these companies. Now, they say they take the names out for the consideration, but being around Illinois for so long, it's hard, you know, I assume for the worst that that is probably going to be political on the selection process. So now it's like the casinos. You just made these more politically connected people more wealthy. Now, that brings me to this point. Instead of making a group of politically connected people more wealthy, I thought of a proposal. Now, I don't know if this is the law in Spain, because I guess some European countries do have criminal laws against drug use. They just don't enforce them. Either in the Netherlands, which you know, everybody says it's legal, that actually it's not legal.
Correct.
It's just tolerated. It's a de facto position rather than a legal position.
Portugal, all drugs.
And for Netherlands, it's only in certain areas.
Yes, correct.
That it's not everywhere in Netherlands. If you go to these areas having a certain vice area.
Yes. Right. Amsterdam, they're trying to prevent drug tourism. They said, well, we're in Germany. We don't want these people going there to the Netherlands, get their drugs, and then come back here with them. So they're trying to restrict the sale to tourists. My daughter goes over there. She goes in, and I wanted a menu. I wanted to see what the menu looked like for just as kind of a historical thing to put in my scrapbook.
Right.
And she said they wouldn't give it to her, but she found a postcard with the menu.
So when I've been to Spain, and I remember I was there with my family, but there was a bunch of spring breakers. They were high school kids or college kids on like a tour. And a lot of them were copping weed, so to speak, using the vernacular, right? So they were copping marijuana. But I guess as long as you had enough for your personal possession, the cops didn't mess with you. In fact, some of the people were smoking a joint or had marijuana, and the cops walked right past them, as long as they weren't doing anything else. Now, my understanding was only for marijuana, however.
Yes. What they did in Europe, basically, is they said, we're going to be tolerant of soft drugs, marijuana. And by doing that, people can get what most people want. The most commonly used illegal drug is marijuana. Now, if they can get that, then they're not so excited about needing this other thing. We already got something. But when then you do what the United States is, we're going to prohibit all of this stuff. You can't have it. Now, when the person goes to buy marijuana in the United States, you're at the same place where they're selling meth and crack, heroin, and all these other horrible things. So you've got the person in the store where they can get this other stuff.
So for Chicago, now there is an understanding why you don't do it in public. If there's children around, you know, if you're a public nuisance.
Sure.
But if you're doing it in your basement or your car alone or in your bedroom, you know, assuming you're 18 or over, you know, and you're not in somebody else's home, it'd be your own home, obviously. Why does the police need to bother anybody? I'm just talking about marijuana.
Sure.
So why not make it legalized for everyone for their own, and I don't know what the amount was. I don't know what the amount is in Spain, but for their own personal use.
You just saved the city of Chicago $43 billion. I congratulate you on your suggestion.
And priorities, because, you know, if we have more murders in Chicago than New York or LA, and New York's almost 2.5 times the amount, and LA's 1 million more people than we are. I think we're like 2.7, they're like 3.7 or whatever it is, well, why would we not be chasing murderers and violent criminals rather than busting some poor guy who's smoking a joint outside? Or,
See, the police are interested in their $100 million a year in overtime. So if it's the end of my shift and I arrest somebody for smoking marijuana, now I've got to book this guy, and now I'm there for 2 hours booking the guy into the system, and then when he goes to court, I got to work overtime to go court time to go take care of this. And then the judge dismisses it, and everybody's happy. The defendant is dismissed, the judge did his job, and I got paid my overtime. If we seized a big ton of drugs like we sometimes do, and we seize cash, guns, and drugs, half of the money that is seized goes to law enforcement, the local law enforcement agency, and half goes to the feds. So in the area where I live, Palos Heights, we have a new police department, and the building costs $4 million. And how much did it cost the taxpayers? Nothing. How much in bonded indebtedness? Nothing. Where do we get the money? Well, in drug deals forfeited, we got the money. So is the chief of police in that town in favor of the war on drugs and prohibition? They're buying squad cars now. Are they in favor of it? They find $3 million in the back of a van that nobody claims in Alsip, and half goes to that town, and they're running the police department off of it. Is the mayor in favor of it? The point I'm making is that the economic benefits of keeping in place a program of prohibition that does not work is still here after 43 years because of the people who are benefiting.
I wanted to ask you about this business of if you were to, in terms of the harder drugs, not just marijuana, but you're advocating also legalization of heroin and cocaine. How would that work in practice? I mean, how, if you were to actually legalize, I mean, what would that mean? I mean, what would people do?
First of all, let me say that LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, if you go on and just put in leap.cc, you'll get our website. We have a statement of principles that proposes what the rules should be regarding drugs. One of the rules says that the regulations for softer drugs should not be the same as for harder drugs.
Okay.
You don't want access to heroin being like it would be for marijuana.
So besides marijuana, what else is a softer drug? What else is considered softer drug?
Alcohol. It's more dangerous than marijuana, but alcohol.
Now, let me break in for a second. Illegal prescription medications are a huge problem.
Certainly.
In some ways, at least in some, for some of them, more addictive, or as addictive.
Sure.
And at least for longer-term health issues like internal organ issues, you know, affecting your liver.
Sure.
Worse, you know, OxyContin, Vicodin,
opiates.
all the opiates, right? Painkillers, as well as psychotropics for people who do not have a psychological or psychiatric issue.
Sure.
So there's people who take recreational clonazepam or Thorazine, right, or Valium or whatever it may be.
Right.
So there's a lot of people that aren't depressed or bipolar, and they take these drugs because it gives them some elevated sense of mind or deactivated sense of mind or whatever it may be. And this is a huge problem too.
Well, it's true that people are abusing substances which are currently illegal. the prohibition is not a successful program to control drugs. And people who, like myself, who are advocating ending the war on drugs, ending prohibition, are not doing so because it will be a solution to the drug problem. It's a solution to the problem with the kids shooting each other, fighting over who's going to control the corner, not having to build so many prisons, of not artificially increasing the cost of health care because the kids in the drug business shooting each other have no insurance. So if we can eliminate some of these costs, we'll have done some societal good, but then let's turn the problem of drugs over to doctors instead of sending a policeman to go solve a drug problem. All of these addictions and man's weaknesses to substances are bad enough without intertwining it with his natural greed. That's a little bit of all of us. And that's what we've done with this prohibition system.
Right. So let's talk about some of the trends we started talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. Colorado, as Don said, now has legalized marijuana.
4 states have
Alaska,
legalized. Oregon.
New Mexico?
No. Washington.
In state of Washington.
But New Mexico had some laws on the books. I thought they were more...
Yeah, but there are only 4 states that have legalized marijuana outright, which are the 4 that you've named. There's one country in the world that has, for the first time, legalized marijuana recreationally, contrary to the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the UN treaty, and that's Uruguay. But there are going to be more states. This next year there will be more states by the people themselves voting to legalize marijuana outright. Right. No one will stop the trend because it's so foolish, and everyone recognizes this war on drugs is foolish and comes with price tags. So the referendums will continue to pass. Politicians will more and more start saying, instead of we're going to save your kids from drugs, say we're going to regulate and control drugs to stop crime and to better control the health issues associated with drug use, because people shouldn't use drugs. Not because the government says not to, but because the people should be deciding themselves not to.
Now, what is the data from Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado?
Since these 23 states have legalized marijuana for medical purposes.
So medical marijuana is in 23 states?
Yes.
And 4 states have outright legalization?
Yes, plus the District of Columbia. Okay. But
for medical, the District of Columbia.
Correct. Correct. Well, and D.C. was also now for recreational marijuana.
Now, California has medical marijuana. However, it becomes de facto recreational.
Yeah, but let me explain what I was going to say. You asked for some data. What's happened is in these 23 states, deaths from the overdose from opiates has decreased by 25%. DUI arrests have decreased in Colorado because people, instead of drinking, are smoking. So there's less crime. There are fewer kids using drugs. Everything is the opposite of what intuitively we would think would be the result. In Portugal, they said, well, if you now let anybody possess any drug they want for personal consumption and it not be a crime, we're going to have this crime wave and drug wave, and exactly the opposite happened. They had less crime, fewer health problems, people exercising discipline themselves.
Now, not every place where they've legalized in polar part, though, has been so stellar. In England, where they legalized heroin use and addiction rose 4 times the amount, and they found that when people got their government methadone or government heroin, then they broke in and they would steal money to buy the illegal heroin. Wow. So when you have an illegal and legal market side by side, you still have people wanting more and more and more.
Well, the difficulty is when substance is illegal, it's difficult to tell how many people are really using it. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of statistics saying that it's 4 times more use. People who are using heroin or cocaine now, when it's illegal, are going to use cocaine and heroin when it's legal. And the people who choose not to use it now aren't going to use it then either. I ask people, I say, well, I'm adamantly opposed to legalizing this or that drug. Well, when we legalize that, are you going to use it? Oh, no. Well, who are you worried you're going to use it? Well, that other guy. Well, why do you think he's any dumber than you are? So People have to have more trust and confidence that people are going to make good decisions if we don't change the economics of the transaction so dramatically that it's artificially making things worse.
Now, there's also a racial element. People tell me, okay, well, in Mexico, they're so violent or whatever, or why are they dealing drugs? And I always tell people, well, stop using drugs. If we stopped using drugs in the United States, there would be no narco cartels in Mexico. And I think that's a truism. But then the second part is, and we were talking about this before the show, the Chicago Reader with Mick Dumke and Ben Joravsky did a number of studies about marijuana. One of them they titled The Grass Gap, how almost 9 to 1, I think it was about 86%, was African Americans arrested with marijuana. I'm talking just marijuana and just possession. So marijuana possession, not any other drugs and not dealing. Then when it got to prosecutions, it was 40 to 1, only African Americans. So to me, there's a racial disparity and real concern here about if there's either racism, consciously, subconsciously, whatever, but certainly the effect becomes a racial disparity effect. But then is there a racial intent either on the police or the law or on prosecutors on why this is happening?
There's no question that there's no justification for the disparity and the dark population that we find in jail. One study showed 48 times likely to go to prison in Illinois if you're black instead of white. But every step of the procedure, who gets arrested and who gets let go on the street by the officer? You know, he can throw it away or throw it in the garbage or take it home. Hopefully he threw it away. Or he can take you in. And then you get to court for a hearing and the judge can throw it out or not. And then it comes time for sentencing if it didn't get thrown out, and again a decision is made. Well, each of these decision points are sending a certain shade of people down the chute, and other people are going home. If you have a drug policy in place that you know the President of the United States, that members of the Supreme Court, that members of Congress have used the substances that we're putting people in jail for life for, it's absurd. It's cruel and unusual punishment.
Well, if President Obama had been arrested in
disparately.
Illinois, he'd never been the President of the United States today.
There's no question
that's
about
true.
it. We waste so much human capacity by putting people in prison, labeling them a drug felon, when they could be going back to their family, earning a living and going to school.
All right. Do you think that this leads to I don't know? Did you have any information you wanted to give to people where they can, if they're interested in getting involved in your organization? Is there a way they can do that?
Yes, if they go to leap.cc, they will find our website. You'll see that there's a treaty amendment that LEAP has drafted. If they want to support the proposed amendment of these United Nations drug treaties, which are the prohibition fountain for the world, we can help out not just Americans, but the people in every neck of the woods of the world.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for being on our show. Thank you for watching. Goodbye and God bless.